All right. So this is lecture set 1 for the introduction or for Stat 350. So this first lecture set is just titled Introduction to Survey Sampling. So what we're going to be covering in this lecture set is basically just fundamental definitions. In particular, we're briefly just going to review the definition of statistics and the types of statistics, because those, of course, are the true foundation for any study in stats. Then we're going to look at some key definitions in the context of survey sampling and some motivating examples for why we actually go through this practice. So what is the reason that we would be interested in understanding the different ways that we can collect information from some population of interest? Then we're going to talk about the errors and the different biases that can occur in sampling. You will notice that the errors are plentiful. So there's lots of different things that can go wrong. And of course, as a result, there's lots of different biases that we can observe as well, or be subject to in the process of collecting information. And then at the end of the lecture set, I have some key mathematical definitions. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this unit, but this is just sort of, expected value properties, variance properties, normal random variable properties, things that you would have seen in Stat 265 and Stat 266, but you don't need Stat 266 for this class. And those definitions are there just to kind of as a refresher, like something you can refer to if you don't quite remember this property of the variance operator or whatever. All right, so what is statistics? I use the same quote in all my classes, a body of methods for making wise decisions in the face of uncertainty. Sounds awesome, right? It's that particular quote really is referring to the second definition of statistics, which would be the definition based on, or the inferential definition of statistics. So stats can really be defined in 2 different ways. You could probably define it in 3 or 4 ways if you wanted to, but on one side of it, statistics are raw numbers or values. They are values that summarize information from a sample. For illustration, the sample mean, the average of all values would be a statistic, and it's telling us the average number in that sample. The median, the standard deviation, the variance, these are all different statistics, values that you compute from a sample that summarize the information. With the idea being that if you're staring at 20 values in front of you, you have to make sense of this. You can look at the numbers and get some idea of what might be the largest or smallest, but even in doing that, you're inherently kind of building different statistics in your mind, right? Like, oh, this is the min, this is the max, this is the middle value. These are all summarizing points that give us an idea of how the values relate to each other. So those particular values, the mean, the median, the min, the max, this kind of thing, that would fall under the first definition of statistics. So just values that summarize or organize information. The second definition, so the science of organizing and summarizing. This definition refers to how we actually go about organizing the values, the properties that belong to the different estimators that we have studied. This is something that we will talk about a lot in the first month or so of this class, specifically when we start looking at simple random sampling. We will review the properties of our estimators in the context of SRS quite a bit. And then, of course, what falls out of that is what you can actually do with these estimators, the kind of statements that you can make from these values, how we attach error to it, how we interpret them, this sort of thing. Okay, so we have this idea of descriptive statistics, and then what would be the inferential statistics, so where we use our sample to make a statement about some population parameter. And that idea of inferential statistics, of course, is fundamental for us. That's really what we base all of our work on. And that quote that I started with is really referring to the inferential aspect. All right, so formally, our descriptive statistics, again, these are just the tools that we use to organize and summarize information, or you could think of them as the actual values that we have taken from our samples. So the sample mean, the sample standard deviation, these quantities would all be descriptive values that we can use to describe the sample that we have collected. Our inferential statistics are the tools or the procedures like t-test, confidence intervals, ANOVA, this kind of thing. The tools, the procedures that we use to make a statement about a population based off of a sample. All right, so this distinction is kind of one of the fundamental distinctions in the class. And we will define these things directly, but again, the idea here, and I always kind of use the same illustration. If we have kind of this giant box here, and we think of this box as the population, then our sample is actually just some subset of this rectangular population, right? So the sample could be a smaller rectangle that exists inside the population. So say something here, you know, or it could be any collection of elements. So maybe it's like this circular part over here. So this could be sample 2. And then since we're on the topic of shapes today, it could also be this triangle over here. I gotta master the triangle in order for us to move on. Boom. And this could be sample 3. All right. So the sample, based off the illustration, the kind of big things that we can take away from it in the beginning are that, one, it's a subset of the population. So this sample exists inside the population. The second thing that we can take away from this illustration is that there's different ways that we can collect the sample. For example, here I have a rectangle sample, a circle sample, and a triangle sample. Which one is the best, right? Well, in general, when we try to answer that question, the best or perfect sample would be what we can think of as a scaled down version of the target population. So that is, if our population is that giant rectangle, our sample is a smaller, I guess, rectangle in this case that exists inside the population, but it captures all of the different characteristics of that population. Now, when I say characteristics, what I mean is that the sample has effectively or is effectively a small version of the population where the proportion of gender identifications and the proportion of religious alignments, if you will, and political alignments and ages and interests in terms of hobbies and things like this, all of these different characteristics are equally represented in the sample in the same manner that they are in the population. So the scaled down, the perfect sample would be a collection of individuals or observations whose age and gender, religious alignment, political preferences, hobbies, all of these sort of things are in the same occurrence rates as they are in the population. Now, this, of course, is a very difficult problem because how do you actually capture all of these characteristics? The population is such a dynamic and ever-changing collection of elements where all of these different variables or characteristics, I'll use the same word, where all of these different characteristics are changing rapidly and evolving, and we want to have those in the same proportion when we collect our sample, right? So how do we do this is one of the big questions that we're trying to answer in this course. The perfect sample, which is this basically, toy model of the population where everything is in the right proportion, is going to be extremely difficult to collect. So what would a good sample be? Well, the key word that we use to reflect or to describe any good sample is the word representative. So a good sample will be one that is representative of the population. So a sample where we can use or we can estimate different characteristics of the population with a known degree of accuracy. So what I mean by that in the context of our statistical studies is a good sample is one where we can calculate and quantify error and attach that error to our estimate. So we can say with some degree of certainty, the population mean of this is going to be between this value and this value. And we can explain why that error is what it is, so why that value is what it is. And we can make adjustments to the error based off, for example, sample size and things like this. Right? So the goal of our study really boils down to how do I collect representative samples and how can I have some confidence that this is a representative sample, that I am actually capturing the dynamics of the population in the right, let's say, proportions or at the right rates of occurrence. Okay, so before we get into the nuts and bolts, or maybe these are the nuts and bolts, I guess, before we get into laying down drywall, we'll start with some definitions that are key to the survey sampling study. Okay, so the first definition is that of the element. So this is also the observation unit, and this is the value on which the measurement is taken. Okay, so this particular definition would also be known as, in our previous studies, the observation itself. Okay, so this is the individual, if you will, from which we have taken a measurement. Now, it doesn't have to be a person per se. It could be, a car or a tire or a blender or a tissue box. I'm looking around my apartment right now, a vase. It could be any of these things, but whatever it is that we're interested in taking the measurement from would be considered the element. The target population, of course, is the collection of elements that we want to make an inference about. Okay. So the target population, the description and definition, or let's say the description of the target population is extremely important, because if we want to make a statement about some population, we need to state exactly what the population is that we want to make a statement about. The more general we make our statement, so the more general we make our description of the target population, the larger our potential sample is going to be and the more errors we could run into. But the more that we refine our description of the target population and really sort of focus in or narrow down the collection of units that we want to speak about, the easier it will be to design a survey and collect a sample from that population. So the more general we make it, the more difficult it's probably going to be to collect information. Like, you can imagine that collecting a representative sample from all of Canada is probably going to be more difficult than collecting a representative sample of adult males from Edmonton, for example. But really, if we want to make a statement about adult males in this particular city, there's no reason for us to define the population as all of Canada, for example. Okay, our sample will be a collection of elements that exist within the population. So that's a subset of the population. In that previous illustration, we had the rectangle, circle, and triangle samples, for example. So they're just subsets of the population. The sampled population is the collection of all possible elements that might have been chosen in the sample. Okay, so the sampled population would actually basically just be a list or like the available units from the target population, essentially. So we'll look in a minute at the distinction between the sampled population and the target population in another illustration. But the sampled population would be, again, the collection of all elements that might have been chosen in the sample. The sample is the actual subset that were selected, but both of these are subsets of the target population. The sampling unit is the unit that is selected for the sample. Now, the difference between the sampling unit and the element, well, in some cases, the sampling unit and the element are exactly the same thing. So if we are collecting information from an individual person, for example, the sampling unit, if it is individual persons, would be the same thing as the element. But if we are looking at a larger scale study where we have to, instead of survey or contacting each individual person, we contact, for example, a household, then the household becomes the sampling unit, and then the representative from the household then becomes the element, as they are the person that is giving the measurement. Okay, so the unit is sort of can be the element, the sampling unit and the element can be the same thing depending on the context of the study. But the sampling unit can also be sort of a contact point for which the elements exist, and then one representative element or maybe two representative elements, depending on the study, can contribute information. So they would exist inside the sampling unit. And then the sampling frame would be the list of the sampling units. So basically, so for example, if we are sampling from individual persons, the sampling frame would be, like well, I guess in the modern era, it would be, well, it could still be kind of like a phone book, if you will, where you have a list of cell phone numbers, maybe from a distributor. It could be something like a Facebook group where you have a number of different people aligned to the group and you can contact them individually. It could be an email list. Any of these things could be a sampling frame, depending on the population. All right, so how do these different definitions relate to each other? All right, so so this illustration here shows us the target population. So this large rectangle on the outside is the target population. And then this, I don't know what shape this would be, but this sort of like rectangle with nice curved edges or curved corners, this would be the sampling frame. So this part here is our sampling frame. Okay, so our target population is defined to be, whatever it is for the particular study. You can see here that the sampling frame actually includes information that does not exist within the target population, right? So one of the notes that we can make here is that the sampling frame can include elements that are not in the target population. Okay. Now, this isn't necessarily an issue as long as we're able to determine through either questioning the applicant if we get in contact with them, or based off of our particular frame, making a statement about why, so for example, let's say that the sampling frame is like an email list, but attached to that email list, you have characteristics of each of the different email addresses. So maybe you have like age or gender identification or something like this. If you're only interested in surveying people of a particular age group, in that email list, if you can sort by the number of people that are in that age group, you can then remove the persons that would not belong to the target population. So the sampling frame can contain sort of extra information that we don't need, and through through either using the frame directly to remove those persons, or through contacting them and them asking them some initial questions and then saying, oh, you don't actually meet the requirements of the sample or of the target population, you can then remove them. This isn't an issue as long as you're able to identify those people, right? So in the frame, we have this area not eligible for survey. All right. Now, on the other side of that, you have not included in the sampling frame. So what we can see here is that the sampling frame doesn't necessarily cover every aspect of the target population. So this can be an issue, and we'll talk about errors that can occur we'll talk about how we define this particular issue a bit later. So this would be considered an error. And in this particular case, it would be a coverage error, but we'll talk more about that a little bit later on in the lecture set. And then of the remaining part of the sampling frame, so this part here, all right. Okay, so you can see that what we have inside this red box here, that would actually be the sample. So I twisted these up a little bit earlier, but inside the sample, you have the actual sampled population. So from the sample that we have collected from our sampling frame, the sampled population are the persons that have responded to the survey and have contributed hopefully useful information. And that is what we are going to base our future inferences on. And then within the sample, you also have within the sample, you also have a not reachable part of the population. You have the people that refuse to respond and people not capable of responding. And these three different categories from the sample create another set of issues that we will define and have to work with later. So for example, not reachable would be issues with non-response. Refusing to respond, we could also consider that non-response or maybe measurement error, depending on what kind of information they give us. And then not capable of responding, again, we could consider this sort of a non-response type problem. So all three of these categories here would be areas that contribute to we'll say areas contributing to non-response. All right. Okay, so again, just to wrap up here quickly, what we're interested in is learning how to collect representative samples from a population. The key definitions for our sampling study are given on slide 7. And from those definitions, we can already see that there's a number of different ways that we're going to encounter error, and we can see the structure of our sample based off of the frame. So we're going to talk about the errors that will fall out of this type of illustration. We will try and address these errors as best we can. But really, like, our main focus, once we get past those initial definitions, will be how we can collect information to make our samples as representative as possible. All right, so as I mentioned, I will post all this material to YouTube. I'm going to put this up right after class. It's like a 20-minute rendering process, if you will. I'll timestamp it, and then I'll send you an update just to say this is where it is so that you can get familiar with connecting with these. On Friday, we will have our lecture in the same link as today, starting at 9 a.m. There's no lab for the class. We just have 3 lectures. So every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 9 to 9:50. And then on Friday, I'll also have office hours at 10, but I'll send reminders of that. All right, so if you guys have any questions, please feel free to hang around. And otherwise, have a good day. And I hope you have a good semester. And hopefully this course goes well. So take care. And yeah, I'll talk to you guys on Friday.